Okay, welcome back to another episode of Live Wire. I'm your host, Jared Moore with Mvskoke Media, and Live Wire is the program where we take your questions from the chat. Today's program, if you are a subscriber to our channel, you probably saw some coverage we did over an art installation at the Living Arts Tulsa Chiefs, Clans, and Kin. On the last day of that exhibition, they gave a presentation concerning about the history and the evolution of Mvskoke or Creek hymn singing, right? And that brings me to the guest we have on the program today, which is Dr. Hugh Foley. He is a professor with Rogers State University. He's the guy who gave the presentation at the final day there. So I wanted to have him on the program. Thanks for being on the program, Dr. Foley.
Very happy to be here today. Thanks for inviting me, Jared.
And I want to remind anybody, any questions you may have, just pop them right there in the YouTube chat and we'll get them asked. So to start off with, how did you get started or involved in researching Mvskoke Creek hymns?
Okay, thank you for that question, Jared. Before I start talking, I would just want to give credit to my son's family, the Burden family, because if I had not gotten in that family, this never would have started. Secondarily, I would also recognize my church, Hugh Indian Baptist Church, and I'm a member there, and credit my pastor there, Pastor Eugene Harjo, and all the members there, and all the people in the Mvskoke Baptist and Methodist world from whom I've learned about these songs. So I start with that just by saying,
right.
And I didn't grow up with this information. I had to acquire it as a result of the family process. So once all that started...
Well, and just to interject real quick, are you a citizen of any tribe? No. Okay. Nope. That just got that out there. All right.
Everybody knows what that means.
Right.
This, all right? From the Stahedke tribe. Back in the 1990s, I was doing my research into the origins and significance of jazz music from Mvskoke. I went to Mvskoke High School. I didn't really know anything about the rich musical history of Mvskoke, and so I started looking into that. Around about that time, I got married, and all of a sudden was very involved in the Mvskoke world via my son's mother and the family. So we started attending a couple of different Mvskoke Baptist churches, and Hugh Indian Baptist was and still is her family's ancestral church. So it's been going on for over 100 years now, and so I started going to church and I started listening, and then as I started listening, I started putting some things together, meaning where this music came from. And so that led to a whole story, really, of events that I'm very grateful to have been a part of, but didn't really expect. So what really happened was I just started going to church and learning these songs, and then I started asking questions, and then I had to put the history together. And then once I did that, a couple of other people got interested. And then the other things happened. The Yale documentary, and then I worked with Sterling Harjo on This May Be the Last Time. And so that was really significant because it got a lot of people's attention on the historical significance of these hymns and all of the various ways in which they both evolved and how they function in the church world today. So really, in answering your question, it started with family, and then it became scholarship and lifestyle, and that's really where we are today. As I've gone on a big full circle historical journey in learning about these songs, and they've really enriched my understanding of what American music is.
Well, I think that was one of the most interesting things about your talk too, and I want to kind of talk about the history of the hymns, in a second, but I do want to talk a little bit about the historical importance of Mvskoke Creek hymns outside of the tribe, even, from a national or even an international level, because that's one of the things that I think that citizens understand the cultural heritage and the importance of the history from their own tribal perspective. But I think, just like you spoke about in your talk, how the hymns could be considered the first synthesis music, or the first music of America, because of the different influences that it encapsulates within itself, is something that's important for citizens to hear, that not just tribal members are putting importance upon this art form, it's also like just the academic community, and now it's like with the this may be the last time, it's even moving into international spheres and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about you told the story about the Yale conference. Could you just for our audience kind of go through that story again and tell that story?
All right. So some years ago, I was teaching a music appreciation class at Rogers State, and I was beginning to understand more and more about Mvskoke hymns. And so as I started to put the whole story together, one of the other things that I do is broadcasting on a weekly basis. So I teach on Rogers State University television, I teach cinema and Native American history, and then I also have a couple of radio programs, one on the university radio station at RSU, and the other KUSH in Cushing, both of which hit Mvskoke Nation. So Professor Willie Ruff, Yale University music professor, had put together a conference on what was known as line singing, and he brought together three congregations. A congregation from Scotland, the northern area of Scotland, what's known as the Outer Hebrides. These are the islands that are very small and off the coast, and a place where things are conserved that on the mainland don't necessarily get conserved, or the main island, I guess we'd say. In addition to that, he brought an African-American group from the south, Sipsey River, Alabama, I believe. And then he brought a Anglo group from Kentucky, and they were from the Indian Bottom Baptist Association. And they all sang in this lined out style that comes from the Scottish Missionaries, which is where the person who's leading the service says the line and then the congregation sings it, because this comes from a period when most people weren't literate except the person leading the services. Okay, so these three groups come together and they share their commonalities. And so NPR was there, and they did a feature story on it, which then aired on Tulsa University College radio station, KWGS. And as we tell the story, and this may be the last time, my friend Jane heard it, and she said, wait, there's more people that sing like that. Mvskoke Creek people sing that way, once she heard it on NPR. So she contacted Willie Ruff. Willie Ruff then contacted me, because he asked her who he should talk to, and she suggested me since she listened to my radio program on Sunday mornings on RSU. Okay, so he calls me, Professor Willie Ruff. I'm interested in Mvskoke hymns. I said, okay, well, maybe you can come out and check it out. He goes, oh, I'll be there this weekend. I mean, he was like ready to check it out. Because wanted to see what was up. Okay, so he came out, and I took him down to church, Hutchjubba, and you could tell that he realized that there was a connection. There was something happening here that he didn't know about, and that was that fourth element, because Mvskoke people were right there on the border of contemporary Alabama, Georgia. Some of the very first missions are there. We know that the hymns get introduced there, the Scottish hymns, that then take on melodies of slaves of African descent, and then translated into the Mvskoke language. So you do have a tri-cultural product. And this I brought up some time ago when I kind of thought about it, was, okay, well, all American music is combined traditions, right? So the Mvskoke hymn tradition, in my view anyway, and I presented this at Yale when we all got invited up there, I was like, I think we can call this the first American music. And maybe it's a little bit semantic in some ways, but what I talked with Sterling about was, well, what do you think is the first American music? And I went through the list of like Yankee Doodle or blues or country or whatever. Well, Mvskoke Creek hymns combine traditions linguistically, musically, contextually of Native people, people of Anglo-European descent, people of African-American descent. Find me another earlier tri-cultural product, especially music, and the challenge I've put out there is for somebody to do it, and you don't get it. Now, of course, I don't include traditional First Nations music or American Indian music, because that, I believe, is its own category. You could say that's the real first American music.
Yeah, and it's kind of like what you're talking about, too, is like the American from the standpoint of post-European contact, the synthesis of the cultures, as opposed to where you have Native American music that is purely could in theory be traced back to songs sung before Europeans were on the continent.
Yeah,
right?
The original language of God is sometimes what we say about the traditional music. And so all that's correct. So contemporary Mvskoke people can be really proud and happy of being part of this early American musical tradition that is within the American religious music tradition, but also combines some things that a lot of those other American musical traditions do not have. And that's specifically because these three groups came together to produce this music. And what makes them especially rich, if you go further and further into them, is the dualistic meanings of some of the hymns, in that some were created on the removal and post-removal, and some can be interpreted as relating to both the spiritual journey of this world to heaven, and also the literal physical journey of the people from the homelands to contemporary Mvskoke Nation. And so you have a lot of stuff that's wrapped up in them. But I always say that it's important to remember that these things are for church, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't study them. You know, we study Bach's church music and Mozart's church music and Beethoven's church music. So it's not that those, just because it's church music, is not relevant. In this case, it's probably even more relevant, because a lot of people had to suffer for these hymns to happen. And then once in Indian territory, just prior to the Civil War, the Mvskoke Creek Council did not want Christianity as part of the new Mvskoke Nation. They felt that it was taking the ceremonial people away from the ceremonial grounds. And so I've heard stories, and everybody knows stories of early on, not the women, but the men, if they went to a prayer service, church meeting, something like that, as they left and they were going home in the dark, they'd get accosted and beat up. Well, this fit right into the suffering narrative of Christianity. So on one hand, the ceremonial people try to teach a lesson. On the other hand, the Christians are like, well, Jesus said it was going to be this way, and it is. So then you get into all kinds of theological things, which is not really my point of view or perspective. Right. I'm just really looking at the beauty of the Mvskoke hymns, and then we get to all of the extra benefits of them. That's with any singing, you know, as a meditational pathway to spiritual enlightenment. Yeah. And not only that, but singing together as a social group, we also know that that's good for us. In addition to that, when you sing the hymns, you breathe more deeply. It's good for you to sing. Not only that, but the hymns, for the most part, are in the Mvskoke language. So it's, for some people, an entryway into the language, because if you can just read a hymnal, you know, then I don't know if that'll come through on the camera or not, but if you can read the hymnal, you're at least beginning to learn some words and constructs and how people pronounce things and that kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. In addition to that, one other thing is, when you go to church, there are all these cultural lifeways all around you that are related to very deep Mvskoke cultural ways, but sometimes people dismiss them because it's a Christian church setting. And I think that's one of the mistakes of undervaluing the Mvskoke Christian tradition. Yeah. Is because often people are very conservative in that environment, they have conserved some ways, words, foods, just ways of doing things that if you don't go to a ceremonial grounds or a church, you might not know. Well, so there's a lot of things happening out there. Yeah, and I have some questions about some stuff that occurred to me while I was at your lecture. But for the audience, and I'll get to those, but and this is a challenge for you, I know, because what I'd like to see, I'd like to see if you could encapsulate the historical part of your lecture, you know, like distill it down for the audience of how we go from
or the all of those different influences, like the Scottish Missionaries, that and like so, and with like a historical context, and end up today without all the slides and as quick as you could, or like as succinctly as you could. I know it's almost impossible. So,
well, there's so many ways to go with it. If you just do the basic, simple version, it's more or less what I said earlier. Scottish missionaries show up. Well, let's back up for a second. 1796, George Washington sends Benjamin Hawkins into Cherokee Mvskoke Nation with the whole idea of setting up a system to bring in missionaries.
Okay.
So you start there. So that's when we tend to think that the hymns start to begin, is right at the end of the 1700s. There's a historical source that I won't reveal now because I don't have that particular piece of paper out in front of me, but there's an earlier case of some missionaries teaching some Mvskoke people some hymns, but it's not widespread. Mm-hmm. So flip on up to 1800 and we get to these, early establishment of churches. But you have to remember, when we're talking Mvskoke history, it is chaotic at this time.
Yeah.
So you have the beginnings of the beautiful aspect of Mvskoke hymns, but all these land cessions to the British, the Mvskoke you're making, the Mvskoke Civil War, 1813, 1814, the whole Battle of Horseshoe Bend, all the rest of the land cessions. It's a very tumultuous time for people in the Mvskoke Nation at that time. But we know the first missions, by the Baptists anyway, came around about 1808 in Georgia.
Okay.
So Mvskoke people didn't want anything to do with the religion, but they were smart enough, and there was enough mixed people within the tribe by that point that they realized the missionaries in the school provided information they needed if they were going to be able to compete on the world stage, diplomacy, laws, and all that. Mm-hmm. So they wanted the school part and the skills, but not the religion, because people already have a religion. So there wasn't like a whole lot of really movement in this area, and the historical moments we have are small, but they're there. By 1826, most Mvskoke people are out of Alabama and Georgia. White people, start coming into Alabama and all of that. We start to see more missions around 1820, 1830. But what's really interesting is Scots start marrying into the Creeks, sending biracial children to school. Baptism and conversion was also perceived as a strategy to not get removed. Hey, if I'm a Christian, they'll leave me alone.
Yeah.
So you got all these dynamics swirling around this whole thing. When we start talking about Indian Territory itself, you have all these people coming here. And one of the things we've heard over and over, that there are stories, some of the hymns that we have, and these were told to me, that they represent this harsh time. And if you look up a song like Yama Istimithkitan, for instance, when it talks about crossing the Death River. Okay, so that Death River is not only the symbolic, spiritual Death River from here to there, it's the Mississippi, where we know all kinds of terrible things happened to Mvskoke people. Steamships exploded, people were pushed off the boats for fun, for the soldiers' fun. I mean, all kinds of bad stuff happened there. Okay, so... But these songs come with them, and some of them, not all, but some. But what we hear, some of the earliest hymns come from that period just prior to and during removal. So there's another one, Mvskoke Folana, and I apologize for my Mvskoke language speaking. It sounds like
you're doing
the heck talking, but still, there's that one, and that's one they say that's one of the old ones because it has some of the most African American spiritual elements. You can hear it when you listen to that song. And so you've got this deep African American melodic tradition. You've got this Christian tradition coming from the Scots, which was non-denominational, by the way. They were sent by the Society for the Preservation of Christian Knowledge.
I see.
And all they were about was Christianity. It was not a denominationally specific. But the first Baptist services that we know of were held in Indian Territory in 1832. If you go north of Mvskoke, that's still Mvskoke Nation, there's a Baptist church there called the Fountain Baptist Church, just on the other side of the river, like if you go north, you go to Porter. If you go to south, there's this little church there,
Mm-hmm.
and a church is still there today. The preacher was named John Davis, and the very first church in Indian Territory had 3 blacks, 2 whites, and the Mvskoke preacher. By 1832, October of 1832, there were 10 natives, 26 slaves, and 1 white man baptized by Davis. So by 36 and 37, 16,000 more Mvskoke people come to Indian Territory, remembering 3,500 at least didn't make it, and probably more. And so a lot of these hymns call up this, very, very difficult time. And some of these hymns correlate the removal. Others are just hymns because people started translating English Christian songs into Mvskoke. And
Right.
so that's the point where things start to divide a little bit. And we can interpret some of them as connected to the removal, but others we have to put in the historical context of being interpreted from an English hymn into a Mvskoke language.
Yeah, and I think that's also something that's interesting. This is one of the points that occurred to me when you were talking at the lecture is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like the call and response, or the structure of the hymns themselves, is kind of from the preacher standpoint or the religious missionary standpoint, a way to teach the people that you're singing with the hymn to how to recite the passages that you're saying to them. They're repeating verbatim what you say. And
Yes.
so it's really interesting to me because now we see that kind of like you were mentioning happening in reverse, where the Creeks took that what you would say is a structural component, and now you can use that to teach the Mvskoke language to the people, because they're using something that would have originally been a way for the person to absorb the scripture that's referenced
Right.
in the hymn. But it's also like now it's like you can absorb the language components for the Mvskoke language by that same mechanism. To me, I thought I was thinking, is that accurate? Do you think that's an accurate statement to make?
Well, what you're essentially saying is that originally Christianity is coming through the hymns to the people, but now in some cases the language is coming through the hymns to the people.
Yeah,
That's kind of what I'm
because
getting out of that.
well,
This
and
is
that's,
something I've heard in other places around Indian country,
Mhm.
that music is often the quote final resting place for some tribal languages.
mhm,
The reason why is a lot of those tribal languages are not spoken actively every day between people.
yeah,
You might have hello and thank you and some other words, that are still used, but the songs are able to be maintained and taught, and the words in them are able to be passed on. So we see this with other tribes. Mvskoke people are lucky that there's still a bunch of fluent Mvskoke speakers around.
yes,
Now, most of them are 60 plus,
mhm,
but still yet, these songs are a way to begin learning this language. And with regard to lining out or call and response, the only difference there is lining out is where you do the line and the congregation sings it.
mhm.
Call and response would be a different response to whatever
I
the
see.
guy has said,
Mhm.
So, but all this comes about, and you have to remember that there was a lot of tension in the Mvskoke Nation after removal in the 1830s. I mentioned that the Creek Council threatened to punish anyone who attended Christian services with 100 lashes in 1837. So it took a long time to kind of get through this. But one thing I want to talk about briefly is the impact that people of African descent, black people specifically, Dualistic, had on what was happening. Once the white missionaries were kicked out of Creek Nation, black men became the preachers because they could speak both Mvskoke and English. And so that brought in a heavy influence of this African American spiritual style. And this is what I found. This is a really important quote. 1842. An army colonel is at that church I was talking about earlier, what's most likely now the Fountain Baptist Church, which is a black Baptist church. 1842, he wrote this, and this is a quote.
Mhm.
Creeks, half-breeds, and Negroes are engaged in prayer and singing psalms. The language and music were those of the Creeks and the whites, and the lyrics were those of the slave spirituals. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure he had it all exactly right.
Right.
Like, because he even knew what he was listening to.
Mm-hmm.
But he kind of got it all in there. And wherein you see that it's a mix of all this different musical background and cultural background.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I bring up Mvskoke Hymns, because that song really gets to the core of that whole concept. One of the things about the way that I learned the Mvskoke churches grew with the songs was many were autonomous, they were independent, so they could kind of do what was best for their community and their area. And a lot of these churches are connected to families, and so that wherever the family lived, that's where the church was, and people went there. And if it was too far away from other people for them to go to that church, then they would start their own church. And so these would meet in houses, and it just ultimately developed. But there's so many fascinating things about the Mvskoke church world. And, of course, we're focused on the music here, but what we're starting to see is a real appreciation for these mm-hmm. songs. And, talking about people learning now, we're seeing more hymn singings, churches holding singings where people can learn and come and learn the hymns. I saw some of the brothers, I think down in Dustin, are having a regular hymn singing where they're just working on the songs. And sometimes perhaps people go to church and there's all the church stuff's going on and they want to hear the songs and sing, but they don't necessarily, or they don't line up with whatever's going on in the church. So it seems like there are these groups that have sort of evolved that just want to sing the songs.
Right.
And
right.
So we see a lot of that. Oklahoma City has one. I think there's one in Okmulgee on a regular basis where people are just getting together. But not only that, now we've seen things like Jared Tate, the Chickasaw composer, making a symphony out of a Mvskoke hymn and mm-hmm. bringing in Curtis Scott, a deacon at Salt Creek, to sing and show how it fits together. And then, we've also heard, someone like Joy Harjo, she includes Mvskoke language in her mm-hmm. music. And you think about Julian B. and how he put Mvskoke words in his hip hop and all that.
Absolutely.
So it's not like the Mvskoke hymns are the only place where Mvskoke language appears mm-hmm. in music. But this musical form is very significant historically, and I think people are still just learning about it. Yeah. Sterling's film did a tremendous amount of good because it got people into the fact that these songs are really unique, special, spiritual meditations that come from a very unique and powerful place. I was watching Kyle Bell has a new short film. I think it's called Spirits, and in it, hymn plays a significant part. It's about a young man who's going off to college to play basketball. He's nervous about it, so he has a little spiritual meeting with his grandmother, and they sing a hymn together. And so that shows you that here we are, 2022, young filmmaker trying to make a statement with his film, brings in a Mvskoke hymn to show how that music is a spiritual fiber between the grandma and the son.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It means a lot. Well, so there's a lot going on, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've been on for a while.
Oh no, it's great. And really, you could talk about this subject. We could talk about it for a long time. We're getting close to the wrap time.
Fine.
And I do want to tell the audience too, if you are watching this and you're interested in this topic, you should, and you haven't checked out Sterling Harjo's "This May Be the Last Time," that film, you should go check it out because it deals with this topic. And I know you do a lot of broadcasting. Is there, because you had the slides and everything for your presentation, is there anywhere on the internet that somebody could go see that presentation or some type of version of it that you know of?
I'll tell you, it's kind of evolved over time. I learn something new all the time. I'm always changing it. If someone just wants the presentation, they can just contact me through Roger State. My email's real easy to find. I'll just send them a copy of it, and they can peruse it as they would. Okay. My issue is that you don't publish it because there's some unique photographs and other things in it. But I'm happy to share that. If you dig, somewhere on YouTube, I went to St. Louis one time and did a presentation for a Scottish organization.
Okay.
On this thing, and it's in there somewhere.
Okay.
And I do kind of a basic version of the talk, but what I'd really do is just share this PowerPoint with anybody who's interested. And I would say that I saw a quote at one point from the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma, and there was a gentleman named Eddie Lindsay, and he said, "We've been studying when our Creek Baptist churches began to decline. And once we started losing our Creek singing, our growth stopped."
Mm-hmm.
And so that shows you that it's connected to identity, and people go, they want to hear it. But here's the issue. Now there's not as many people that can sing the songs as there used to be. And so,
right.
You get to a point where you hear the same 10 songs all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you may go to a more rural, conservative church, and there may be an older person there, and then that's when they break out one. And if they do, you better do your best to try and learn it. But there's a lot of them recorded. Mm-hmm. There's nothing like sitting in church and singing with your brothers and sisters, making that joyful noise, out of many voices one. And the whole concept is praise or meditation as a spiritual pathway to enlightenment, in this case, Christianity.
Yep. All right. Well, great. And thanks so much for coming in today. If you guys out there want to learn any more of this, or maybe you want to have Professor Foley speak at your event or something, you can go to Rogers State University's website, and he's listed as a faculty on there, and it has his email, so you can get in touch with him. I might try to hunt down that talk you were talking about on YouTube and include the link in the description for this video if I can find it. I don't see any questions in our chat right now, and we're right at the wrap time. So, Mado, thank you so much for coming in today, Mr. Foley. Dr. Foley.
I would say Mado to everybody listening, and I would just, again, thank my church, Hutch Jubb Indian Baptist, my son's family, the Burden family. I wish the whole Mvskoke Nation a tremendous amount of success. We've been going through a lot of turmoil here the last couple of years, and I think it's going to get better. It's just one of these things that gives us a good reason to go to church or meditate or sing these songs. Mm-hmm. Keep on going. Mvskoke, right?
Absolutely.
Keep on striving. Keep on striving. So that's my encouragement to everybody, is just find the good in everything and keep on going.
Yep, words of wisdom. And, well, we'll check you guys out later, and Chihichoth, Lise.